I accidentally found an $80,000 receipt in my husband's jacket from a jewelry store, an engagement ring with a diamond. We've been married 45 years. He always said, "There's no money for jewelry." The receipt had a delivery address. When I arrived there, I saw my husband with, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought I was the kind of woman who missed things. For 45 years, I believed I knew my husband. Knew him the way you know a house you've lived in for decades. Every creak of the floor, every draft under the door. His name was Gerald Whitmore. And for 45 years, I thought I knew every corner of that man. We had built something real together. We raised 2 children in a 3-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio. I taught second grade for 31 years. Gerald worked in commercial insurance, and when he retired at 68, we settled into the quiet rhythm of old age. Morning coffee on the porch, Tuesday dinners with our daughter Patricia, crossword puzzles on Sunday. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, or so I believed. The first sign came on a Thursday in October, and I almost let it pass without a second thought. Gerald had started dressing differently. Nothing dramatic, but a new belt here, a nicer watch there. He'd always been a practical man, the kind who wore the same shoes until the soles gave out. But that fall, he began ordering things online, things he'd quietly carry in from the porch before I could see the boxes. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself he was simply enjoying retirement. Wasn't that what we'd saved for? Then came the credit card statements. We had always shared finances. A joint account, an open ledger, nothing hidden. But that September, Gerald suggested, gently, even warmly, that he get his own card. "Just for ease," he said, "so I can handle my golf expenses without bothering you." I agreed. I shouldn't have. But at 71 years old, I did not yet know how to be suspicious of the man who had helped me through my cancer surgery, who had held my hand in every hospital waiting room, who had said, "I love you," every single night without fail for 4.5 decades. The golf outings became more frequent. He was gone some Saturdays from morning until nearly 8 in the evening. I asked once, lightly, carefully, if he'd like me to join him for dinner at the club afterward. He smiled and said the guys like to keep it men only. I believed him. And then there was the phone. Gerald had never been secretive with his phone. It sat on the kitchen counter, screen up, buzzing freely. But that November, he began carrying it in his shirt pocket. He began leaving the room to take calls. Once, I walked into the study while he was typing something, and he closed the screen so quickly that his coffee cup toppled over. He laughed it off, said he was booking a surprise for Patricia's birthday. I smiled and handed him paper towels. But something had shifted in my chest. A cold, quiet awareness, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply settles in. On a Wednesday in late November, I was looking for my reading glasses in the front closet when I found Gerald's old winter jacket, the charcoal one I had not seen him wear in 2 years. I checked the pockets out of habit. People leave all manner of things in coat pockets. I had found birthday cards, grocery lists, old receipts. I found a receipt. It was folded twice, printed on heavy cream paper, and when I opened it, my reading glasses were suddenly not necessary at all. The numbers were large enough. $80,000. Paid in full. From a jeweler downtown, Callaway and Sons Fine Jewelry, an address on Meridian Street I recognized from their television advertisements. The item, a diamond engagement ring, round cut, 4 carats, platinum setting. And at the bottom, a delivery address I did not recognize. I stood in that closet for a very long time. The walls smelled like cedar. Gerald's old jacket hung limp in my hands. Outside, I could hear the television in the living room. The evening news, the familiar drone of it. And I thought, how many evenings had I sat next to this man, believing we were watching the same world? How many years had I thought I understood what was inside that coat? $80,000. He had told me we couldn't afford new kitchen counters last spring. He had said, gently, reasonably, that we needed to be careful with money now that we were both retired. I folded the receipt back along its original creases. I put the jacket back on its hook. I walked out of the closet and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to Gerald laugh at something on the television. And for the first time in 45 years, I did not go sit beside him. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed and listened to Gerald breathe, that slow, even breathing of a man with a clear conscience. And I stared at the ceiling and cataloged everything I knew: an $80,000 ring, a delivery address I didn't recognize, a secret credit card, a phone pressed close to his chest like a second heartbeat. By 3 a.m, I had moved from disbelief to arithmetic. I am, at my core, a practical woman. I taught second grade for 3 decades, which means I spent 31 years breaking complicated things down into their simplest parts. So I lay there in the dark, and I did exactly that. We had roughly $400,000 in a joint investment account. The house was paid off, worth perhaps $280 given the neighborhood. Gerald had his pension, his Social Security. I had mine. We had no significant debts. By any external measure, we were comfortable, secure, but how much had already disappeared? The secret credit card had been open for at least 4 months. 4 months of dinners I hadn't shared, of gifts I hadn't seen, of a life I hadn't been invited into. And now, a ring worth more than some people's annual salary, delivered to a woman whose address I had folded up and placed back in a coat pocket, like evidence at a crime scene. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Evidence. The fear came later, somewhere around 4 a.m. Not the sharp fear of danger, but the slow, spreading fear of humiliation, of being the woman who didn't know. The wife everyone else had pitied quietly at church while she went on pouring coffee and smiling at Sunday potlucks. Patricia would be devastated. Our son Robert, out in Portland, would want to fly home immediately and say things that couldn't be unsaid. My friends at the library book group, Donna, Helen, Marvine, would look at me differently, no matter how kind they tried to be. But underneath the fear was something steadier. Anger has a way of providing its own kind of ground. By 5 a.m, I had made a decision. I would not confront Gerald that day or the next. Not yet. Confrontation without proof is just accusation, and accusation without evidence hands the accused all the power. I had spent enough years in a classroom to understand the difference between what you suspect and what you can demonstrate. I needed to see the address on that receipt. The following Tuesday, while Gerald was at his regular lunch with his old colleague Dave Hooper, a lunch I had no reason to doubt, and perhaps should have doubted sooner, I went back to the closet. The jacket was still there. The receipt was still in the pocket because Gerald, for all his new secrecy, had apparently not thought to clear his own coat pockets. That small carelessness told me something about the nature of his confidence. He did not believe I would look. I photographed the receipt with my phone, both sides. I wrote the delivery address in my own handwriting in the small notebook I keep in my purse for grocery lists. 4417 Claremont Drive. I looked it up that afternoon on my laptop while Gerald napped. A condominium complex. 12 units, built in 2019. Nice, from the photographs. Modern, glassed. The kind of building you see advertised in lifestyle magazines aimed at young professionals. Not the kind of place one associates with a 72-year-old retired insurance man, unless he was visiting someone who lived there. I sat at my kitchen table with my cold cup of tea, and I felt the full weight of what I was considering. Because the next step was not a small one. The next step meant driving to that address. It meant looking at something I could not unsee. It meant crossing from suspicion into knowledge. Could I take that back? Once I knew, truly knew, could I choose to go on as before? I thought about 45 years, not as a sentimental montage, but plainly. 2 children raised, 3 moves. My cancer, his heart scare in 2018, Christmases and arguments and reconciliations, and the grinding, ordinary love of a shared life. I thought about the kitchen counters I had not replaced because we needed to be careful. I closed my laptop. I got my coat from the hook by the door. My coat, not Gerald's. And I drove to Claremont Drive. The condominium complex was exactly as the photograph suggested. Clean and modern, glass and pale brick, a small fountain near the entrance that was turned off for winter. I sat in my car across the street for nearly 20 minutes. I told myself I was simply gathering information. I told myself I could leave at any time. And then Gerald's car turned into the complex entrance. I watched him park. I watched him walk to the building. Not the walk of a man visiting a business acquaintance, but the easy, familiar stride of someone who had been here many times. He had a key fob. He used it without hesitation. My hands were very still on the steering wheel. When the door closed behind him, I took out my notebook, and I wrote one more thing beneath the address. He has a key. That was my first piece of evidence. And I understood, sitting in that cold car on Claremont Drive, that I needed more before I could do anything at all. I needed the kind of evidence that doesn't bend under pressure, the kind that doesn't disappear when a man turns on the charm and says, "You're imagining things, Margaret." My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 71 years old, and I was not imagining anything. That evening, I called a divorce attorney. Her name was Susan Albright, and she came recommended by Donna from Book Group, whose niece had used her in a difficult custody matter 3 years prior. I called from my cell phone on a Wednesday morning, while Gerald was at the gym. I sat in my car in the garage with the door down. Susan Albright was direct in the way that capable people tend to be. No unnecessary softness, no performance of sympathy. She asked me clear questions. I gave her clear answers. By the end of 40 minutes, we had an appointment for the following week, and she had given me a very specific list of instructions. Document everything. Touch nothing jointly held without legal advice. Do not confront your spouse. Do not move money. And this was the instruction that gave me pause. Do not share your plans with anyone who might, intentionally or otherwise, inform your spouse. I thought of Patricia. I thought of Donna and Helen and Marvine. I thought of the way information moves through the people who love you, even when they mean no harm. I kept my own counsel. The appointment with Susan was on a Thursday at 2 p.m. in a quiet office near the courthouse on 5th Street. I told Gerald I was having lunch with Donna. He kissed my cheek at the door. The ease of that gesture, the automatic, unthinking domesticity of it, made something harden in me that I don't think has ever fully softened since. Susan reviewed what I had, the photograph of the receipt, my written notes. The credit card I had confirmed was opened in Gerald's name alone by calling the general customer service number and saying only that I'd seen the card and wanted to understand the account. They confirmed it existed. They confirmed I was not on it. That was enough. It's a start, Susan said, but we need financial documentation, account statements, asset valuations, anything in writing. And if there is an ongoing relationship with a third party, documentation of that relationship will matter for the asset division conversation, depending on how your state handles marital misconduct. Ohio is an equitable distribution state. Susan explained what that meant in careful, measured language. It did not mean equal. It meant fair, as determined by a judge who would weigh the length of the marriage, the contributions of each spouse, and yes, potentially, evidence of dissipation of marital assets. $80,000 spent on a diamond ring from a joint account or a secretly opened line of credit could constitute dissipation. I drove home that afternoon with a clearer mind than I had had in weeks. What I did not know, what I would only understand later, was that Gerald had already begun to sense something. Not because he was perceptive. Men who deceive their wives for months rarely develop sudden sensitivity. But because, as Susan had warned me, the act of consulting a lawyer changes something in your bearing. You carry yourself differently when you have begun to act, rather than simply endure. Gerald noticed. Not clearly, not accurately. But he became watchful in a new way. He asked me twice in 1 week how I was feeling. He suggested, unprompted, that we plan a trip to see Robert in Portland in the spring. He brought me flowers on a Friday. Not for any occasion, just because. I thanked him. I put the flowers in water. I said nothing. But someone else had noticed too. Her name, I would learn it soon enough, was Diane Holloway. She was 44 years old, a divorced interior designer who lived in Unit 6 at 4417 Claremont Drive. I learned this not through any dramatic discovery, but through the deliberate, methodical work of a private investigator named Ray Kowalski, whom Susan had referred me to on the day of our first meeting. Ray was 60, unremarkable looking, in the way that made him excellent at his work. He drove a beige sedan. He charged $450 a day plus expenses. I paid him from my personal savings account, money I had accumulated over 30 years of teaching and had kept, always, in my own name. Gerald had thought this mildly eccentric. I had thought it merely sensible. Ray worked for 2 weeks. On the 15th day, he sent me a sealed envelope by mail. Inside was a photograph of Gerald entering Unit 6 with a key. A photograph of him and a dark-haired woman, Diane Holloway, confirmed, at a restaurant in Columbus, 30 miles from Dayton, where he was unlikely to be recognized. A printed record of a payment from Gerald's secret credit card. A hotel in Cincinnati, 2 nights, 2 months prior. A printed listing for the ring from Callaway and Sons, publicly available on the jeweler's custom commission showcase, with the client listed as G. Whitmore, occasion noted simply as engagement. Engagement. I sat at my kitchen table and I read that word 3 times. Gerald was in the living room. I could hear him. The television was on, some golf program, and he was laughing quietly at something. Was this the man I had nursed through a heart scare? The man who had held my hand in the oncology ward and told me he couldn't imagine his life without me? I placed the photographs back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my tote bag under the lining, where I keep my important documents in a hidden zip compartment I have used for 30 years to keep track of things worth keeping. This was not a suspicion anymore. This was a fact. And facts, unlike suspicions, have consequences. Susan filed the petition for divorce on a Monday morning in December. I was not present at the courthouse. I was at home, making breakfast. Gerald was still asleep. I scrambled eggs and I listened to the morning birds at the feeder outside the kitchen window. And at 9:17, Susan texted me 2 words. It's filed. Gerald was served at 11:40, at the door of Unit 6 at 4417, Claremont Drive. I know this because Ray had confirmed, at my request, that Gerald would be there that morning. I had not planned it as a dramatic gesture. I had planned it because I did not want Gerald to be served at our home, in front of neighbors, in a way that would embarrass us both unnecessarily. The choice of location, as it turned out, conveyed its own message. Gerald called my cell phone 12 times between noon and 2 o'clock. I did not answer. At 2:15, he came home. I was in the kitchen with a cup of tea. He stood in the doorway with the papers in his hand, and I watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession. Shock, calculation, and then, settling like sediment, a kind of wounded indignation that I recognized from 45 years of marriage as his default defense. "Margaret," he said, "we need to talk." "My attorney's contact information is on the petition," I said. "Please direct your communications through her." He stared at me. I think he had expected tears. He had perhaps expected a scene. Accusations and counter-accusations. The kind of confrontation he could navigate with charm and justification. What he had not expected was a woman who had already moved 2 steps ahead of him. "I don't know what you think you know, Gerald," I said. "I know about Diane Holloway. I know about the ring. I know about the Cincinnati hotel. And I know about the engagement." I said it quietly. I picked up my tea. There is nothing left to misunderstand. The silence that followed was of a particular quality I had never experienced in that kitchen before. He left the house that evening with a bag. He did not tell me where he was going. I did not ask. 3 days later, the calls started. Not from Gerald, from Diane. She called my cell phone, a number I did not know how to explain her having until I realized Gerald must have provided it. The first call I did not answer. The second, I did. I wanted to understand who I was dealing with. Diane Holloway had a voice that was carefully controlled, in the way of someone who believes control is the same as power. She told me that I was making a terrible mistake, that Gerald loved her, that they had been together for 2 years, that he had been planning to tell me in his own time. She told me that if I proceeded with the divorce, I would be the one left with nothing, that she and Gerald had spoken with a financial advisor, and that the assets were structured in ways that would favor him in court. "You're 71 years old," she said. "Be practical." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it is important to be honest about the whole of it. I felt afraid. Not the cold, manageable fear I had felt in the car on Claremont Drive, but a hot, rushing fear. She had said financial advisor. She had said structured. She had implied prior planning. How long had Gerald been preparing? What had he moved, hidden, restructured in anticipation of exactly this? I called Susan within the hour. Susan was not alarmed. She was, in fact, reassuring in the specific practical way that good attorneys are reassuring. Not by minimizing the threat, but by outlining exactly what could and could not be done. "If he has moved marital assets," Susan said, "there is a paper trail. Courts take a very dim view of financial dissipation and asset concealment. And the fact that his girlfriend is calling you directly is, frankly, Margaret, not a sign of strength. It's a sign of panic." Susan filed an emergency motion to freeze jointly held assets pending the divorce proceedings. It was granted within 48 hours. 2 days after that, Diane Holloway appeared at my front door. She was, in person, a handsome woman. Dark-haired, expensively dressed, the kind of compose that comes from practice. She stood on my porch in a camel coat and told me, very calmly, that if I did not drop the divorce petition, she would go to Patricia and tell her things about me. Things, she implied, that I would find humiliating. I did not know what she meant. I'm not sure she meant anything specific. I believe she was testing the nature of my courage. I opened the door fully. I looked at her. "Diane," I said, "I have cancer survivor credentials and a good attorney. You are welcome to say whatever you like to whoever you like. My daughter is a grown woman, and this conversation is being recorded." It wasn't, technically, but the statement served its purpose. Diane Holloway stepped back off my porch, walked to her car with great dignity, and drove away. That evening, for the first time since October, I cried. Not from grief, exactly, but from the accumulated weight of it, the sheer exhaustion of holding oneself upright for so long. I cried for about 20 minutes in the bathroom with the door locked, and then I washed my face, and I called Patricia and asked if she wanted to come for dinner on Saturday. I needed a few days, and I allowed myself to take them. Gerald tried a different approach in the second week of January. He called, through his own attorney this time, properly, to suggest mediation. Not divorce mediation, mind you. A conversation. An opportunity, his lawyer's letter phrased it, to discuss the matter in a spirit of mutual good faith. Attached to the letter was a handwritten note from Gerald himself, 3 paragraphs long, in his careful, slightly formal handwriting that I had loved for decades. He was sorry. He had made terrible mistakes. He did not want our family torn apart. He asked me to think about what 45 years meant. He suggested, gently, carefully, that we could find a way through this together. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in the envelope with Ray Kowalski's photographs. The pull of it was real. I want to be clear about that, because it would be dishonest to say I felt nothing. I did feel something. I felt the 45 years he was asking me to remember. I felt the particular grief of being asked to choose between the life you had and the truth you've discovered, and understanding that those two things cannot coexist. A marriage built on a lie is not the marriage you thought you had. The 45 years were real, but so was Diane Holloway. So was the ring, so was the Cincinnati hotel receipt. You cannot mourn a thing and also be deceived by it. Eventually, you must choose one. I responded through Susan. My answer was 2 sentences. I was open to discussing asset division. I was not open to reconciliation. Diane, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Ray, who I had retained on a reduced schedule, confirmed that she and Gerald were still in regular contact and that she had been seen visiting his attorney's office. This was not surprising. What was surprising, and what Susan noted carefully, was that Gerald had not moved back into the Claremont Drive condo. He was staying with his old colleague Dave Hooper in a guest room in a house on the east side of Dayton. The arrangement had the flavor of a man in limbo, neither fully committed to one life nor able to return to the other. Diane, I suspected, was not pleased, but she was watching, and Gerald was watching, and I understood that my steadiness in the coming weeks would matter enormously. It was Patricia who gave me the thing I hadn't known I needed. I had told her the full truth on that Saturday dinner, carefully, without theater, with the photographs folded into my tote bag in case she didn't believe me. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which is something she has been able to do since she was 9 years old, and is one of the things I am most proud of in her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mom," she said, "what do you need?" Not "what should we do about Dad?" Not "are you sure?" Just, "what do you need?" I told her I needed someone to go with me to my next appointment with Susan. I told her I needed someone who would not make this about being angry at Gerald on my behalf, because my anger was my own, and I was managing it. And I told her that I needed, very much, for someone to occasionally come over and watch a film and eat takeout soup with me, because the evenings had become very quiet. She came every Thursday. Through Patricia, I eventually told Helen and Marvine from Book Group. Not Donna, who I love dearly, but who has the information containment capacity of a colander. Helen, who had been through her own difficult divorce in her 50s, said only, "You're doing it right. Keep going." Marvine brought me a pot of beef stew and sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours talking about absolutely nothing relevant, which was exactly what I needed. I was not alone. And the knowledge that I was not alone meant that Gerald and Diane's silence, their watchful, strategic stillness, was not threatening. It was simply weather, something to move through. I kept my appointments with Susan. I responded to legal communications within 48 hours. I did not call Gerald. I did not drive past Claremont Drive. I went to my regular Tuesday water aerobics class. I finished a novel I had started in October and promptly started another. I replaced the kitchen counters. Gerald had said we couldn't afford it. I found that we could. Gerald appeared at the house on the last Sunday of January without calling ahead. This was, technically, still his legal residence. The divorce was not final. The house was jointly owned, and Susan had advised me that I could not bar him from the property at this stage, though she had noted in dry terms that showing up unannounced was not the behavior of a man negotiating in good faith. He was wearing the new clothes, the nicer clothes. He had lost weight. Whether from guilt or from the effort of maintaining 2 lives, I couldn't say. He stood at the door and asked with great gentleness if he could come in and talk. I let him in. I made no tea. We sat in the living room, the same room where he had watched the news on the evening I found the receipt. And he began speaking in the tone I recognized from our most difficult moments across 4 decades, careful, reasonable, calibrated to make the other person feel that agreement was the same as intelligence. He said the divorce proceedings were going to cost us both a great deal. He said the attorneys were the only real winners in situations like this. He said he understood he had hurt me, that he was not proud of himself, that he had made mistakes. He said, and here his voice shifted into something softer, something that, in another year, I might have believed, that Diane had been a mistake too, that he had ended it, that what he wanted, if I could find it in my heart, was to come home. I looked at him. When did you end it? I asked. He hesitated for only a moment, but it was a moment I had been waiting for. Recently, he said, after the petition was filed. So after you were served with divorce papers, you chose to end your engagement with another woman. We hadn't formally. Gerald, I said. The jeweler's showcase listed the commission as an engagement ring. I have the documentation. The careful reasonableness shifted, not dramatically. Gerald was never a dramatic man. But something tightened around his eyes. Then the door opened. I had not heard a car in the drive. But Diane Holloway walked into my living room as though she had been waiting outside, which, I would later confirm, she had been. They had come together. The peaceful conversation had been the opening act. She was the second. She sat down without being invited. She placed her handbag on the arm of my late mother's chair, which I found, irrationally, the most offensive thing that had happened that afternoon. She said she was not there to argue. She said she was there because she cared about Gerald's well-being and because she believed, sincerely, she said the word sincerely, that what I was doing to him was cruel. She said I had had 45 years. She said that the world had changed since we were married. She said that Gerald deserved to be with someone who made him feel alive. Did she think I had made him feel dead? She said the legal proceedings could be resolved quickly if I was reasonable. She used that word twice. Reasonable. She said there were ways to structure the settlement that would ensure my comfort. A fair portion of the assets, the house if I wanted it, a clean break for everyone. She said Gerald would be generous. She looked at Gerald, and he nodded, and the performance of their coordination was so visible, so transparent, that I felt something almost like pity. Almost. What they were offering was a quiet, dignified exit. Accept a negotiated settlement they had already designed. Cause no further disruption. Be reasonable. Be grateful. Go gently. I thought of Susan's frozen asset order. I thought of Ray Kowalski's photographs. I thought of Patricia at my kitchen table every Thursday. I thought of Helen saying, "You're doing it right." I thought of the kitchen counters I had replaced with my own money. "I'd like you both to leave," I said. Diane looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at me. Neither of them moved immediately, and in that pause, that held, calculating pause, I felt the flash of fear return. These were not careless people. They had come with a plan, and when the plan failed, people like this did not simply accept the outcome. They recalculated. "Margaret," Gerald said very quietly, "think carefully." It was not a request. It was dressed as one, but it was not. "I've been thinking carefully since October," I said. "Please leave. If you need to communicate with me, you have my attorney's contact information." They left. Diane's expression, when she picked up her handbag from my mother's chair, was not composed. It was cold, in the way of a woman who has decided something. I locked the door and stood in my living room for a long moment. My hands were not shaking. They felt steady, the way hands feel when everything has been decided, and all that remains is to see it through. The fear was there. I would not pretend otherwise. But fear and resolve are not opposites. Sometimes fear is simply proof that what you're protecting is worth protecting. I picked up my phone and called Susan. The deposition took place in Susan's conference room on a Thursday morning in late February. Gerald was there with his attorney, a younger man named Foltz, who wore expensive cufflinks and had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to settlements. Diane Holloway was not present. She had no legal standing in the proceedings, but she was, as I had come to understand, never far from Gerald's decisions. I sat across the table from the man I had been married to for 45 years. He was wearing his good suit. He looked tired. I noted this without feeling what I expected to feel, which told me something about how far I had come since October. Susan was beside me. She had organized the documentation with the precision of someone who understood that clarity was the most effective form of pressure. I had seen the binders the evening before, in her office, and had been struck by how much truth fits neatly into tabbed folders when someone takes the time to gather it. She began with the financial records. Gerald's secret credit card had been active for 22 months, not 4. 22 months of expenses that Susan had now obtained through formal discovery. Dinners, hotel stays, weekend trips, flowers, a spa booking, and yes, the engagement ring commission at Callaway & Sons. The total expenditure from marital funds, either through the secret card or through withdrawals from the joint account made in increments small enough to avoid immediate notice, came to $112,000. When Susan said the number aloud, something happened to Gerald's face that I can only describe as a rearrangement. Foltz put a hand on his arm. "That figure is contested," Foltz began. "It's from your client's own account records," Susan said, with a pleasantness that carried no warmth. "And from the formal discovery request your office confirmed 3 weeks ago." She set the documents in front of them, organized, tabbed, dated. Then she placed Ray Kowalski's photographs on the table. Not all of them. Susan had selected precisely. The entrance to Claremont Drive, the restaurant in Columbus, and the jeweler's commission record showing G. Whitmore, engagement ring, delivered to 4417 Claremont Drive, Unit 6. Gerald had been given a portrait of his own decisions, laid flat on a conference table. I watched him look at the photographs. He looked at them the way a person looks at evidence of a thing they know is true, which is differently from how they look at something they can dispute. There was no performance of surprise. There was only a stillness that told me he had always understood, somewhere beneath the charm and the reasonableness and the Tuesday golf lunches, that this day was coming. We also have, Susan said, a voice recording of a phone call made to my client on December 14th, in which a third party threatened my client's reputation and referenced specifically the asset division proceedings as leverage. She set a transcript on the table. We believe this constitutes intimidation of a party in a civil proceeding. We have referred the matter to our client's family attorney for review. Foltz looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the transcript. And then, for the first time in this entire ordeal, Gerald lost his composure. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the careful reasonableness, that practiced, lifelong architecture of pleasant surfaces, gave way. His voice, when it came, was thin and strained. Margaret, this has gone further than— Mr. Whitmore, Susan said, please direct your comments through your attorney. This is my wife, Gerald said, and there was something raw in it, something that might once have reached me. But I had sat in a closet holding a receipt for $80,000. I had driven to Claremont Drive in November and watched him use a key that wasn't mine. I had spent 4 months building the kind of case that doesn't bend. And I had stood in my own living room while another woman sat in my mother's chair and told me to be reasonable. I had been reasonable. For 45 years, I had been reasonable. What I was now was prepared. I was your wife, I said, and I took that seriously. The documentation on that table is a record of how seriously I took it. Foltz asked for a recess. They took it in the hallway, and through the glass panel of the conference room door, I could see the shape of an argument. Foltz gesturing in the controlled way of a professional, Gerald very still in the way of a man who had miscalculated the distance between where he was and where he thought he would be. They came back after 12 minutes. Foltz said they were prepared to discuss a revised settlement structure. Diane Holloway called Gerald's cell phone twice during the recess, according to the log Ray had been maintaining. Gerald did not answer either call. I found this significant. I also found it clarifying in a way I had not anticipated. Because watching a man refuse to answer the phone of the woman he had nearly ruined his life for told me something about the nature of what they had built together. It had been built on the assumption that Gerald would win. When winning became improbable, the architecture began to show its weaknesses. When a man stops answering the phone of the woman he left you for, in the middle of a deposition that is not going the way she planned, that is information. Susan and I had discussed carefully and in advance what I wanted. Not revenge, not punishment exactly. Courts are not designed for that. And Susan had been clear-eyed about what was achievable and what was theater. What I wanted was my fair share of 45 years of partnership and accountability for the assets that had been dissipated. By the end of that Thursday, we had the framework for a settlement that Susan described, with professional understatement, as favorable to me. I drove home alone in the early afternoon light of a February Thursday in Ohio. The streets were gray and familiar. I passed the library where I had taught summer reading programs for a decade. I passed the church where Gerald and I had been married in 1979. I turned onto my street, into my driveway, and I sat in my car for a moment. I thought about the woman who had driven down this same street every evening for 30 years, carrying grocery bags and graded papers, and the quiet faith that the house at the end of it was exactly what it appeared to be. I was glad she had finally looked more closely. Then I went inside and put the kettle on. The final settlement was signed on a Friday in April. I am going to tell you what I received, because I think it matters to say it plainly. I received the house, free and clear, with Gerald's equity share transferred to me as part of the asset division. I received 60% of our joint investment account. The additional 10% above an equal split was ordered by the mediator in recognition of the documented dissipation of marital funds. I received my own Social Security, and Gerald's was not affected, but I received a portion of his pension, established by a QDRO, that would supplement my income for the remainder of my life. The secret credit card debt, all 22 months of it, was assigned to Gerald entirely. $112,000 in debt. His alone. The engagement ring, that 4-carat, round-cut, $80,000 ring that had been sitting on Diane Holloway's hand since January, was flagged in the proceedings as a dissipated marital asset. Gerald was required to include its value in the asset accounting. It did not come off Diane's finger, but its cost came off Gerald's settlement share. Whatever satisfaction she took from wearing it, she was wearing something that had already been paid for twice. Once by Gerald, and once by the accounting that stripped it from his column and credited it to mine. Gerald did not contest the final terms. Foltz, to his credit as a professional, had clearly advised his client to accept. Gerald looked, on the day of signing, like a man who was simply trying to reach the end of something. He held his pen with the same careful grip I had watched him use for 45 years. Grocery lists, birthday cards, holiday checks to the grandchildren. And when he signed, he did not look up. He looked, I thought, very tired. I was not unkind about it. I have known this man since I was 26 years old. The betrayal is real, and the grief is real. And I will not pretend that signing those papers felt like nothing. It felt like closing a door that had been standing open for too long, necessary, and still a finality. You don't spend 45 years with a person and walk away from the table feeling nothing, but unkindness would have cost me something I wasn't prepared to spend. I signed my name, Margaret Elaine Whitmore. And when it was done, I thanked Susan, shook her hand with both of mine, put on my coat, and walked out of that building into the April air. Patricia was waiting for me in the parking lot. She had taken the morning off work. She held a coffee from the place on 5th Street that makes it properly strong, and when she handed it to me, she said, "How do you feel?" "Like myself," I said, and that was the truest answer I could give. Not triumphant, exactly. Not hollow, either. Simply like a woman who had done what needed doing and was ready now to do something else entirely. Diane Holloway, for her part, did not receive the ending she had planned. Within a month of the settlement, Ray Kowalski, whom I had retained through the proceedings and then released with a handsome bonus, confirmed through mutual social connections that Gerald and Diane's engagement had been quietly discontinued. Whether Gerald broke it off, or whether Diane, confronted with the full financial reality of a man who had emerged from a divorce carrying a $100,000 debt and 60% fewer assets than she had calculated on, made a pragmatic recalculation of her own, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that the woman who had sat in my mother's chair and told me to be practical had apparently applied that same practicality to her own situation and found the numbers wanting. I don't need to know the details. What I know is that the ring was purchased, the debt is his, and the engagement is gone. Robert flew in from Portland for a weekend in May. He was angry, in the way of a son who loves his mother and needed someone to be angry at, and I let him be angry for an appropriate amount of time before I told him, firmly, that what I needed from him was dinner and a walk by the river, not a prosecution. He laughed, a little reluctantly, and we had both. We walked along the river path in the early evening, when the light comes low and warm across the water, and he held my arm the way he used to when he was small, and the world felt large. I was grateful for it. The house felt different in those early weeks. Quieter, obviously, but also, and this took me some time to put words to, cleaner, as though something that had been accumulating for years without my knowing it had finally been addressed. I replaced the living room sofa. Gerald had picked the old one. I chose a good one, sturdy, the right height, the color of deep sea glass. I put it near the window, where the afternoon light comes through longest. I sat in it on a Saturday morning in May, with a novel and a cup of strong tea, and I thought, this is mine. Not in the bitter sense, in the true sense, in the sense of something earned and known and kept. The first summer without Gerald was also the first summer I can remember, in a very long time, that felt entirely mine. I signed up in June for a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center, something I had wanted to do for 20 years and had always set aside for reasons that, in retrospect, had more to do with habit than with any real impediment. The instructor was a wiry, opinionated woman named Loretta, who wore paint on her forearms the way other people wear watches, and she told me on the first day that I had good instincts and terrible patience, which I took as the highest possible compliment. I went every Tuesday. Helen and Marvine joined me for a long weekend trip to Savannah in July. We had talked about that trip for 6 years and had always found reasons to defer it. We stayed in a bed and breakfast near the squares. We ate shrimp and grits at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and felt absolutely no need to justify it to anyone. Helen cried a little at dinner on the last night and said she was glad I had called her. I said I was glad too. Patricia and her husband Thomas took me to Italy in September. We spent 10 days in Tuscany, Florence, Siena, a farmhouse outside Montalcino that Patricia had found through an architectural preservation group she volunteers with. I am not, by nature, a sentimental traveler. I do not weep at paintings, but I stood in front of a fresco in a small church outside Siena, early on a Thursday morning when the building was nearly empty, and I felt, I can only describe it as something opening, a sense that there was still a great deal to see and time in which to see it. I was 71 years old. I had never felt less finished. My watercolors improved. Loretta said so, grudgingly, in the specific way of a teacher who doesn't flatter. I painted the river behind the Arts Center 4 times before I felt I had it right. I painted my kitchen window with the new counters. I painted the sea glass sofa in the afternoon light. The painting of the sofa I gave to Patricia, who put it in her hallway and sends me a photograph of it every so often when she walks past. I also, in October, began volunteering 2 mornings a week at the literacy program attached to the public library, teaching basic reading skills to adults, which is different from teaching children, and also, in its own way, very much the same. There is something clarifying about sitting across from a person who is working very hard to learn a thing that others take for granted. It puts your own difficulties in order. I did not date. I did not particularly want to. Several people, with the best intentions, suggested that I might, that companionship was important, that I shouldn't close myself off. I appreciated the concern, but I was not lonely. I had Patricia and Thursday dinners. I had Helen and Marvine. I had Loretta and watercolors and literacy mornings and the sea glass sofa. I had, more than anything, myself. Which sounds like a small thing until you've spent time not quite having it. Gerald's life, from what I could observe at the dignified remove I maintained, did not open the way mine did. He sold his car, the newer one, within 3 months of the settlement, presumably to address the debt. He moved from Dave Hooper's guest room into a smaller apartment on the north side of Dayton, a 1-bedroom in a complex I recognized as being a step down from what we had shared, and several steps down from what he had apparently promised Diane. I know this not from surveillance, but from Patricia, who saw him at Robert's birthday call in October and noted that he looked diminished in a way she was careful to describe without satisfaction. Robert, who is less careful than Patricia, said flatly that their father looked like a man who had made a very expensive series of errors and was now living with them. Diane Holloway listed her condo at 4417 Claremont Drive for sale in August. The listing stayed active for 11 weeks before the price was reduced. The reduction for a modern unit in a desirable complex suggested urgency. Ray, who had long since moved on from my case, had nothing to do with this information. I simply noticed the listing while searching the real estate sites one idle Sunday morning with tea and the kind of mild, clear curiosity that is very different from the pain that used to accompany thoughts of Claremont Drive. She moved, as best I can determine, somewhere out of state. She left no forwarding address in any public record. The ring, that 4-carat, round-cut, $80,000 ring, presumably went with her. I find, when I think of it, that I feel almost nothing at all. It is a ring. It was purchased with money that the courts recognized as mine. That accounting was made. The object itself is simply an object. In November, I finished a painting of the farmhouse in Tuscany from Patricia's photographs. It wasn't technically perfect. Loretta would have had several notes. But when I held it up to the kitchen light, it looked like something that had been seen and remembered and held. That is the best thing I can say about the past year. It looked like something real. If this story taught me anything, it's this. The most dangerous thing you can do at any age is confuse loyalty with silence. I was loyal for 45 years. I am not ashamed of that. But loyalty does not require you to ignore what is plainly in front of you. Dignity is not passive. Sometimes it picks up a phone and calls an attorney. I was 71 years old when I found that receipt. People sometimes suggest, gently, that I might have chosen an easier path. Perhaps they're right. But easier is not the same as right. And I have always believed that the truth, however difficult, is a better foundation for a life than a comfortable lie. Now I'll ask you, what would you have done? If you had stood in that closet holding that receipt, what would your next move have been? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this story meant something to you, please consider sharing it. It costs nothing to pass along something true. Thank you for listening to the whole of it. That means more than you know.